At exactly 200 a.m., the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway of the military housing building. Naomi Carter shot upright in bed, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear the blood rush in her ears. Years of deployment in Afghanistan had trained her body to wake at the slightest sign of threat, but this was not the sound of a fellow soldier returning late from night duty. This was different, slower, heavier, deliberate. The handle of her door rattled once, and then silence fell so thick she thought she might suffocate on it. A half-second later, the door burst inward with a crash that splintered the wooden frame, the boom reverberating against the bare walls. Standing in the doorway was Frank Carter, the man who had claimed to be her stepfather for nearly 15 years, but who had been nothing more than her tormentor. His chest heaved as if he had sprinted down the hall, his shoulders filling the doorway. The dim light from the corridor threw his face into shadow, but Naomi could still see the veins throbbing on his temples, the tightness in his jaw, the look of pure rage that turned him into something monstrous. She had seen armed insurgents run toward her convoy with explosives strapped to their chests, and still she had felt less fear than she did at that moment. Behind him, another figure shifted into place. Rick Carter, Frank's younger brother. The uncle Naomi had never wanted and never trusted. He stepped forward just far enough to push the door shut, the metallic click of the lock sliding into place, slicing through her stomach like ice. His fist remained wrapped around the knob's steady calm, as if he had rehearsed this role many times. Together, they had her boxed in, Frank in front, Rick behind. No exit, no way out. Naomi reached instinctively toward the nightstand for her phone, her lifeline, her single connection to security. But Frank moved with startling speed for a man of his size. His boot lashed out, striking the phone with brutal precision, sending it flying against the far wall where it shattered into useless pieces. Plastic fragments rained across the floor. "You thought you could hide from family." Naomi Frank slurred the smell of bourbon leaking into every syllable. Rick's voice came from behind the door, low but urgent. "Hurry up. Do it now." Someone might hear. The reminder was unnecessary. Naomi already understood this was a planned invasion, not some impulsive, drunken rage. They had studied the building, studied the schedules, waited until the guards changed shifts, and the halls were deserted. This was not random. This was a hunt. Naomi's bare feet pressed into the cold tile as she pushed herself backward toward the far corner. Her body trembled, but not from weakness. It was the tremor of adrenaline, the familiar burn that had kept her alive in firefights. Her eyes locked on Frank's massive frame, searching for weaknesses, calculating distance, remembering drills. She could almost hear the voice of Sergeant Williams from training shouting in her ear. Assess, evaluate, respond. But there was a cruel twist here. This was not a battlefield. This was her home. She was not a soldier standing against an enemy army. She was a daughter facing the man who had terrorized her childhood. And now his brother was sealing the trap. Frank stepped closer, the floor creaking under his weight. His shadow spread across the room, swallowing the photographs on the wall. Pictures of Naomi with her unit overseas medals pinned proudly to her uniform, the American flag from her deployment ceremony. All those symbols of strength seemed to fade in the presence of the man who had once told her she would never amount to anything, who had crushed every dream before it had taken form. He raised his fist, the same hand that had bruised her mother countless times, the same fist that had slammed tables and walls until fear silenced everyone in the house. Naomi's breath caught in her throat, but she forced herself not to cry out. She had promised long ago she would never give him that satisfaction again. The silence grew unbearable until Naomi's voice cut through it, calm and sharp. "You cannot control me anymore. Not here." Frank's laugh was low, bitter, and terrifying. "You think this base protects you? Security is distracted right now. Rick made sure of it. We have 15 minutes and then it will be too late." Naomi's blood chilled. 15 minutes. Enough for him to finish whatever he had come to do. Rick rattled the doorknob again, confirming the lock. "No one's coming, Frank. Get it over with." Naomi's eyes flicked toward the dresser where a small jewelry box sat. To anyone else it was decoration, but she knew the truth. It was an emergency beacon given by her closest friend Sarah after a near ambush overseas. 3 presses would send a distress signal across the base. The distance was short, but it might as well have been miles. Frank's bulk stood between her and salvation. The window was reinforced glass 3rd-floor drop with no balcony. The bathroom was a dead end. Options narrowed by the second. Frank lunged his hand, clamping onto her shoulder like a vice, slamming her against the wall so hard her vision blurred. The picture frame of her mother from years before crashed to the ground, glass shattering. "You poisoned her against me," he hissed, inches from her face. His spit hit her cheek as his voice rose. "Everything was fine until you started pretending to be a soldier." Naomi's mind snapped back to training. She shifted her weight, twisted her body, drove her knee upward with every ounce of force. It connected with his thigh. Not perfect, not disabling, but enough to make him stumble back with a curse. She rolled away, grabbing the desk chair, lifting it between them as a fragile barrier. "Fine." She spat back, her voice shaking with fury, but not fear. "You isolated her. You imprisoned her. That is not love." Rick pounded once on the door. "Time, Frank. We need to go now." But Frank ignored him, consumed by the fire of losing control. He seized the chair from Naomi's hands and hurled it aside. For a brief second, Naomi saw not just Frank, but every tyrant she had ever faced. Every man who thought power came from breaking someone else. She fainted right, then dove left toward the dresser. Fingers trembling, she touched the hidden switch on the beacon. 1, 2, 3. Frank's hand caught her ankle, dragging her backward across the cold floor. Pain shot up her leg, but her fingers had already pressed the signal. Somewhere on base alarms would be flashing, MPs would be moving. Hope flickered through the fear. "No more," she gasped. "Your reign ends tonight." Frank loomed over her eyes, wild face twisted with rage. Rick's shadow stretched under the door, the silent warden ensuring no escape. But Naomi's lips curled into the faintest smile, even as Frank pulled her closer. She knew she had lit the fuse. Help was coming. The predator had walked into a trap, and he did not even realize it yet. That night at 2:30 a.m., the battle for survival had begun, and Naomi Carter would not go down in silence. "My name is Naomi Carter. I served in Afghanistan. I wore the uniform of my country and stood in deserts where the air burned hot during the day and froze cold at night. I had stared into the eyes of enemies who wanted me dead. Yet nothing ever shook me as much as the man who claimed to be my stepfather and the brother who stood at his side. When people imagine soldiers, they picture medals, flags, and glory. What they do not see are the ghosts we carry. Ghosts born not only on battlefields but in homes where love should have lived. I was 13 when my real father died. It was a sudden heart attack. One moment he was mowing the lawn on a warm Saturday, and the next he was gone collapsed in the grass while the mower rattled forward until it stopped against the fence. The ambulance came, but there was nothing they could do. My mother, Linda, stood in the yard, her hands over her mouth, and I remember screaming so loud my throat ached for days. The funeral blurred past in casseroles and kind words from neighbors, but the house was never the same. My father's chair sat empty at the table. His laughter no longer filled the kitchen. Mom went through motions like a shadow, teaching her 3rd-grade class by day and then coming home to sit silently in the dark. I tried to help her. I cooked from the recipes my father had shown me, watered his garden-folded laundry before she got home, but grief had hollowed her out. That was when Frank appeared. He came to fix the leaking roof during a November storm. He owned a construction company, or at least that was what he told us. I would later learn his so-called associates were men who worked off the books, people he could control. That day, he climbed onto the roof with practiced ease, patched the holes, and when Mom tried to pay him, he waved her off with a smile that never touched his eyes. "Neighbors help neighbors," he said. "Your husband was a good man. It is the least I can do." At first, it seemed like kindness. He dropped by again with groceries when Mom mentioned money was tight. He came to fix the furnace before winter. He offered coffee after parent-teacher conferences. Slowly, patiently, he inserted himself into our lives. By Christmas, he was joining us for dinner. By Valentine's Day, he was dating my mother. She started smiling again, and I wanted so badly to believe it was real that I pushed down the unease I felt every time Frank looked at me. There were signs I ignored. The way his jaw tightened when I spoke without being asked. The way he steered Mom away from her sister's phone calls. The way photos of my father began to disappear from the walls, replaced with new pictures where Frank always stood in the center. They married the following September in a small ceremony. Mom wanted family from Indiana to come, but Frank insisted an intimate event would be more meaningful. Just him, Mom, me and his brother Rick as best man. I remember standing there in a blue dress watching my mother exchange rings with this man I barely knew, feeling like I was witnessing a surrender instead of a wedding. After the vows, things changed quickly. Frank convinced Mom to quit teaching. "Why stress yourself when I can provide?" he said. Their bank accounts merged and then became his. The car she drove mysteriously developed problems that only his mechanic could fix. Always the day before she planned to see old friends. When I asked questions, he told me my mother was fragile and needed structure. Too much freedom overwhelmed her. That was his word. Freedom. He used it like poison. Rick became a regular presence. He acted friendly, brought me books, asked about school projects, but then I would hear Frank repeating details only I had shared. I realized Rick was not a friend at all. He was surveillance with a smile. Our home became a fortress. New locks that only Frank had keys to. Security cameras under the guise of protection. Mom's cell phone disappeared, replaced by a landline Frank could monitor. Calls from her sister went unanswered. Old colleagues stopped visiting after Frank confronted them at the door. My vibrant mother shrank into someone unrecognizable. Her voice, a whisper. Her movements, tentative, always glancing at him before answering even simple questions. Once, when I saw bruises on her arm, I whispered to her that this was not normal. She looked away and told me I did not understand adult relationships. "Frank loves us," she said. "He just wants what is best." But I knew. Love does not leave bruises. Protection does not require imprisonment. Care does not erase the memory of the man who came before. Frank had not saved us. He had captured us. On my 17th birthday, I discovered college brochures torn in pieces in the trash. Schools I had asked for information from opportunities Frank had intercepted and destroyed. That night, staring at the fragments of my future, I made a decision. If I could not escape through education, I would find another way. The recruiter's office downtown stood next to the pizza shop where kids from my school hung out. I had walked past it 100 times without imagining it would become my lifeline. Inside, I met Sergeant Rodriguez, who explained the path of training, deployment, and service. What I heard beneath her words was something else. Freedom. Purpose. A strength Frank could never take from me. At home, Frank tightened control. Breakfast at 6:30, dinner at 6 sharp. Any deviation meant consequences. My senior year should have been about prom and college applications. Instead, it was about survival. Rick got a job as a janitor at my school, appearing in hallways and outside classrooms, watching me constantly. My report card arrived with 1B+ in calculus, and Frank slammed the table in fury. "No excuses," he shouted. "You will quit debate team." Debate was my only lifeline. I protested that I needed it for college, and he laughed coldly. "You are not college material. After graduation, you will work in the warehouse. Tom has a position for you. Good money close to home, where we can keep an eye on you." I had seen those warehouse girls. Hollow-eyed, trapped, going nowhere. I begged Mom to intervene, but she stared at her plate, silent, shoulders hunched. That night, I heard her muffled apologies as Frank berated her behind closed doors. The next morning, she wore a turtleneck despite the September heat. That was when I began planning in secret. Mrs. Peterson became my confidant. Under the guise of tutoring, she helped me explore options. Again and again, the military surfaced as the only real escape. Steady pay, education benefits. Most importantly, immediate separation from Frank's reach. She warned I would need parental consent at 17 or wait until 18. 3 months. I could endure 3 months of suffocation for freedom. Frank must have sensed my plans because surveillance increased. My bedroom door lost its lock. Rick drove me to and from school. My backpack was searched nightly. The breaking point came when Frank found a recruitment pamphlet hidden in my calculus book. He held it up like evidence of treason. "Planning to abandon your mother?" he sneered. The slap came fast and sharp. Mom gasped, the first sound she had made in days, but she said nothing. Frank growled that Rick would move in permanently for extra eyes. That was when I knew. Escape had to be more than silent survival. I would not just leave quietly. I would leave loudly with witnesses and documentation. And when I did, I promised myself I would come back. I would not leave my mother behind forever. That vow became the fire in my blood, the engine driving me forward. Frank Carter perfected the art of control the way some men perfect a trade. What began with small gestures soon became a system, a prison built not of bars but of rules, fear, and constant surveillance. The house on Maple Street turned from a home into a place of quiet dread. Every detail of daily life bent to his will. He installed new locks on the doors, always reminding us they were for safety, yet only he carried the full set of keys. He put up security cameras outside, claiming they were to deter burglars, but I knew their real purpose was to monitor us. Mom stopped calling her sister in Indiana. At first, she said the calls kept getting dropped, but later, I found the unplugged phone cord tucked behind the couch. Frank replaced her cell phone with a landline, one he could pick up from the other room to listen in. He told her cell phones were too expensive, too distracting, and that she should focus on the household. Each step tightened the walls around us until even the air felt heavy. Mom began moving like a visitor in her own house, glancing at him for approval before answering simple questions. The vibrancy that had once filled her face was gone, replaced by a timid smile that rarely reached her eyes. I would catch her staring at old photographs of my father, only to hide them when Frank walked into the room. She was shrinking, fading while Frank grew larger in every sense, his voice louder, his rules harsher, his presence unavoidable. Rick played his role too. Where Frank was brute force, Rick was the soft touch, the illusion of kindness. He would bring me books asking what I liked to read, pretending to care. I would talk about school projects and dreams, and later, Frank would repeat those private details back to me weaponized. Rick was the ear that gathered information, feeding it into the machine of control Frank built. It was surveillance disguised as brotherly concern. I hated him more for that false kindness than for any insult. Better an open enemy than a smiling spy. When I turned 16, I brought home a flyer about a college fair. I left it on my desk, excitement fluttering in my chest. That evening, Frank stormed into my room, holding the paper like contraband. His hand cracked across my cheek before I could even speak. My mother gasped from the hallway, but said nothing. The sting burned hot, but worse was the silence that followed. Mom did not rush to comfort me. She stood frozen, her eyes darting between us, fear chaining her in place. Frank told me college was a waste of time, and that girls like me needed to think about family and responsibility, not nonsense like debate teams or universities. That night, I cried into my pillow, grief not only for the pain in my face, but for the betrayal of realizing I could not count on the one person who should have fought for me. Mom had become a prisoner beside me, too broken to resist. School should have been a refuge, but Rick found a way to taint even that. He somehow got a job as a janitor at my high school, always appearing outside classrooms or lingering in the cafeteria. I felt his eyes on me in the hallways, his smile too sharp when he said, "Just keeping an eye on family." Teachers noticed, but none dared to intervene. His presence told me that nowhere was safe. At dinner, Frank interrogated me about grades activities friends. He wanted details. My report card came with straight A's and 1 B+ in calculus. He slammed the table so hard the dishes rattled. "No excuses," he barked. "You will quit the debate team." Debate was the one place where I felt alive, where my voice mattered, where I could argue and be heard. I protested that colleges looked for extracurriculars. He laughed a sound colder than any winter wind. "You are not college material. After graduation, you will work at Tom's warehouse." Tom was one of his associates, a man whose place reeked of oil and despair. I had seen the women who worked there, their faces drained of hope. I could not imagine a future more suffocating than that. Mom sat at the table, her fork unmoving, her shoulders rounded. She did not defend me. That night, I heard them argue behind closed doors. Or rather, I heard Frank's voice pounding like a hammer and my mother's faint apologies. The next morning, she wore a turtleneck, though the September sun beat hot through the windows. Bruises do not lie. I knew then that Frank's power had turned her into a shadow of herself. My anger simmered like a fire under the floorboards, hidden but growing hotter. One afternoon, while folding laundry with her, I tried again. "This is not normal," I whispered, pointing to the dark marks on her arm. She did not meet my eyes. "You do not understand adult relationships," she murmured. "Frank loves us. He just wants what is best." Her words felt like a betrayal, but I saw the tremor in her hands. It was not love that kept her silent. It was fear. Fear so deep it rewrote truth. Fear that convinced her to side with her jailer against her own daughter. I wanted to scream, but I swallowed it, storing it away as another reason to leave, another reason to return stronger. The pattern never changed. Frank barked orders about dinner being ready at 6. If a dish was late or a task incomplete, the consequences came swift, not always visible, but always felt. A slammed door, a table overturned, words like blades cutting deeper than fists. Rick hovered like a shadow, sometimes helpful, sometimes mocking, always reporting. I learned to hide my real thoughts, to keep secrets even from my own face. I learned that smiles could be masks and silence could be armor. Every small act of defiance felt like rebellion. Reading a book Frank had not approved of, writing essays about freedom while pretending they were about duty, hiding college pamphlets inside calculus textbooks. Those scraps of hope were my resistance, but they were fragile. When Frank discovered the military recruitment pamphlet months later, his fury proved how closely he watched. He stormed into my room, holding the paper as if it were proof of treason. "Planning to abandon your mother," he snarled, "after everything we do for you." His hand lashed across my face, sharp and brutal. My mother gasped, but made no move to stop him. Rick smirked from the doorway, pleased to see me caught. Frank growled that Rick would be moving in permanently for extra eyes. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the walls closing in. Escape could no longer be a dream. It had to be a plan. But I knew one truth: if I walked out silently, he would bury my mother deeper in chains. If I wanted to save her, I had to gather evidence. I had to leave loudly, with witnesses, with proof. I would fight back not just with fists, but with intelligence. My resolve hardened into steel. Every bruise I saw on my mother's arms, every slammed door, every time Rick's shadow followed me at school added to the weight of that promise. I would get out. And when I did, I would come back. I would bring the light he had spent years trying to smother. The decision to enlist came to me not in a moment of triumph, but in the suffocating quiet of my bedroom, stripped of a lock, stripped of privacy, stripped of hope. I lay staring at the ceiling one night while Rick's heavy steps paced the hallway outside, his shadow flickering under my door. Frank had declared that after graduation I would work at Tom's warehouse. My future narrowed into a lifetime of oil fumes, hard labor, and his looming presence. The thought of years wasted under his thumb made my chest tighten until I could hardly breathe. Yet escape seemed impossible. He had stripped away my college brochures, torn down my dreams, and surrounded me with his brother's watchful eyes. But a soldier's heart was already forming in me long before I wore the uniform. The urge to fight back, to strategize to survive, was stronger than his grip. One afternoon, I lingered in the library after school, pretending to study calculus, but really waiting until the halls emptied. Mrs. Peterson, my math teacher, who had become my quiet ally, stopped by my table. She noticed the way I tensed whenever Rick appeared outside the classroom door. She noticed the dullness in my eyes where light used to live. She sat down across from me and whispered, "You deserve more than this." That was the first time I allowed myself to imagine a way out. I confided my fear of Frank, the surveillance, the bruises on Mom's arms. Her face hardened. She leaned closer and said, "Naomi, you need to think bigger than this house. Have you considered the military?" I blinked at her, surprised. She explained the benefits, the steady pay, the education, the distance. But it was the word freedom that echoed in my ears. That night, I searched every corner of my mind for reasons not to consider it. the danger, the separation, the risk of war. But compared to the war already happening inside my own home, Afghanistan seemed honest. At least their enemies carried flags and motives. At least there you knew where you stood. At home, the battlefield was invisible and endless. The more I thought, the clearer it became. This was my chance, my salvation, my rebellion. For weeks, I met with Mrs. Peterson under the guise of extra tutoring. She walked me through application papers, explained how to forge my mother's signature if necessary, how to plan carefully so Frank would not find out. Each meeting felt like training each signature practice like loading a weapon. At home, I hid pamphlets inside math textbooks, careful never to leave them where Frank might see. Yet one evening, my precautions slipped. Frank stormed into my room, waving a recruitment flyer he had discovered. His face turned crimson, his veins bulging. "Planning to abandon your mother," he shouted. His hand lashed across my cheek, a blow so fast I could not react. Pain bloomed hot and sudden. Mom gasped from the hallway, but made no move to intervene. Rick stood grinning behind him. Frank leaned down, his voice low and poisonous. "You think you can outsmart me? From now on, Rick is moving in full time. No more secrets. No more games." That night, Rick carried his bags into the basement room, his smirk following me like a curse. My sense of suffocation deepened, but so did my determination. If they thought surveillance could break me, they underestimated how far I was willing to go. I began gathering evidence. With Mrs. Peterson's help, I took photos of bruises on Mom's arms during bathroom breaks at school. I recorded Frank's threats on a small tape recorder hidden in my backpack. I collected scraps of proof like ammunition. The plan was simple. On my 18th birthday, I would sign the enlistment papers officially, no parental consent needed. The recruiter had already agreed to meet me at school away from Frank's eyes. I would walk out, not in silence but in daylight, with witnesses and documentation. I promised myself that my departure would not just be escape but exposure. He would not bury the truth in whispers anymore. But the closer my birthday crept, the more dangerous the house became. Frank's suspicion grew. He rifled through my backpack nightly, searching for evidence of betrayal. He removed my bedroom door entirely, claiming safety, though I knew the real reason was to strip me of privacy. Rick began driving me to school, sitting in the cafeteria, watching me even in the hallways. His presence was constant, suffocating. Yet every night as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I reminded myself that 3 months was a small price for a lifetime of freedom. I clung to that thought the way a drowning person clings to driftwood. The turning point came 2 weeks before my birthday. I overheard Frank speaking to Tom on the phone. He said he planned to put me to work at the warehouse early to break me in before I got ideas. My stomach dropped. He would not wait until after graduation. He wanted to chain me there immediately. I confronted Mom in the basement while folding laundry. "I will not do it," I whispered. Her eyes darted to the ceiling where Rick's footsteps moved above. "You have to," she whispered back, her voice trembling. "Please, Naomi, do not make it worse." She pulled up her sleeve, revealing layers of bruises in yellow and purple. "It can always be worse." My heart cracked at the sight. She was pleading with me to comply, not because she believed it was right, but because survival had beaten down hope. That night, my decision hardened. I would not simply slip away. I would make noise. I would fight with evidence, with truth, with witnesses. The military was not just my escape, but my weapon. On the morning of my 18th birthday, I walked into school with forged papers signed with my mother's name, Mrs. Peterson, standing as witness. By 3 o'clock, the recruiter would arrive to collect me. Frank thought Rick would drive me to the warehouse after class. He smiled at breakfast, smug in his assumption of control. "Tom is expecting you today," he said. "You will start early. It is good money. You will thank me one day." I met his gaze, masking my fury with compliance. "Yes, Frank," I said. The last lie I would ever tell under his roof. At school, I carried my backpack not as a student, but as a soldier waiting for orders. Every step through the halls felt like marching toward battle. When the recruiter shook my hand that afternoon, I felt chains snapping one by one. I walked out of that building free while Rick stood outside waiting in vain. His eyes widened when he realized I was not going with him. He lunged forward, but Mrs. Peterson blocked his path. The recruiter ushered me into the car, and within minutes we were on the road. My heart pounded not with fear, but with exhilaration. The city blurred by the window as if the world itself was rushing me forward. Fort Jackson awaited with its barracks, its drill sergeants, its rules. To most recruits, it was a place of hardship. To me, it was salvation. The first night I lay on a thin mattress in a shared barracks room and smiled into the dark. For the first time in years, I slept without fear of footsteps outside my door. The cage had opened and I had flown free. But even in freedom, one vow burned in my chest. I would not forget my mother. I would not leave her in chains forever. One day I would come back stronger armed, not only with weapons, but with the will to end his reign. That vow echoed louder than any cadence shouted on the training field. It was my true mission. Fort Jackson was nothing like Springfield. The air smelled of sweat and iron, not bourbon and fear. The mornings began with whistles and shouting, not slammed doors and whispered apologies. For most recruits, the adjustment was brutal. They flinched at every order, stumbled through obstacle courses, and cursed under their breath at drill sergeants. For me, the chaos felt like liberation. At last, the rules were clear. At last, the punishments fit the actions. There were no secret bruises, no unpredictable explosions of rage. When Sergeant Williams barked at me to drop and give him 20 push-ups, I did them with a smile because each repetition was mine, my choice, my effort, not Frank's cruelty. Every bead of sweat was proof I was building something new inside me, a body and mind stronger than anything he had ever tried to break. The first week of training stripped away illusions. Recruits cried at night when the lights went out, hiding their tears in thin pillows. I lay awake too, but not from fear. My body was wired from years of sleeping light, always listening for footsteps. The habit made me excel during night drills. When the alarm sounded and others fumbled for boots, I was already up, already alert, already moving. The sergeants noticed. Mitchell, they called me at first by mistake, using my mother's maiden name. You got steel in you. I corrected them once and then let it slide. Carter was a name Frank had poisoned. Mitchell felt like reclaiming a piece of my father. In those early days, I met Sarah Reeves. She bunked above me, a tough young woman from Detroit who carried her own ghosts. She had grown up dodging gang violence, losing friends to the streets. When we first exchanged words during fire watch duty, we both recognized the same weariness in each other, the same habit of sitting with our backs against the wall, scanning exits even when off duty. "What are you running from?" she asked me quietly one night. "A stepfather," I answered. She nodded without judgment. "You, the streets," she said. We became battle buddies in more than the military sense. We kept each other grounded when exhaustion threatened to swallow us. She taught me street fighting tricks that ignored rules and aimed for survival. I helped her memorize military regulations and history. Together, we formed a shield against loneliness. As the weeks rolled on, the obstacle courses that left others gasping felt like playgrounds to me. Years of dodging Frank's fists, slipping out of Rick's grip, had made me quick, light, and unpredictable. Rope climbs were just another version of scaling out of windows. Crawling through mud under barbed wire was less terrifying than crawling out from under the gaze of my mother's captor. The sergeants tested us constantly, shouting insults, pushing limits. But compared to Frank's voice booming in our kitchen, this was theater. I stood still unshaken, and they eventually nodded in respect. By the end of basics, Sergeant Williams pulled me aside. "You've got officer material," he said. "You think about that?" I nodded but said nothing. My only thought was survival freedom and the vow I had made to return for my mother. I threw myself into every opportunity. When they offered advanced individual training, I volunteered. When they needed bodies for airborne school, I raised my hand. Each certification was another lock between me and Springfield, another wall Frank could not climb. My body hardened, my muscles stronger, my lungs iron. For the first time, I looked in the mirror and saw not a frightened girl, but a soldier. Deployment orders came quickly. Afghanistan. For many in my unit, the announcement drew gasps and nervous jokes. For me, it was almost relief. Thousands of miles away from Springfield, surrounded by clear enemies, rather than hidden ones, I felt safer than I had in years. Kandahar air was dry and heavy dust coating everything. Rockets screamed overhead at night. IEDs threatened roads. Gunfire echoed in the distance, yet none of it rattled me the way Frank's footsteps had. The unpredictability of war was easier than the unpredictability of a violent home. Sarah deployed with me. Together we grew closer than sisters. We pulled guard duty side by side, shared meals, and patched each other's scrapes. She teased me for always being awake before alarms calling me radar. I teased her for snoring through mortar attacks. We saved each other more than once. During one ambush when our convoy hit an IED, I pulled 3 soldiers from a burning vehicle. The commendation I received afterward felt hollow. Strangers saw bravery. I saw instinct born from years of crisis at home. I knew how to act in chaos because I had lived inside chaos for so long. I wore the medal but thought of it only as proof that Frank had not destroyed me. Nights in Afghanistan brought quieter battles. I would lie on my cot under the thin canvas of the tent, staring at the stars through gaps in the roof, and think of Mom. Phone calls were rare and always monitored, but whenever I heard her voice, it grew smaller, weaker, as if Frank were siphoning life from her. "I'm fine, honey," she would whisper, and in the background I heard the faint intake of Frank's breath monitoring. My stomach twisted with helplessness. I urged her to leave, told her about shelters, programs, safety plans. She always cut the call short. "I have to go," she said, and the line went dead. That silence followed me through every mission. I carried it heavier than my gear. Still, I kept building myself. Each promotion, each stripe, each new skill became proof that I was not the girl he tried to break. When Sarah and I patrolled villages at night, rifles ready, I felt stronger than I ever had in Springfield's kitchen. Yet guilt clung to me. I had escaped, but Mom had not. Every time I saved a fellow soldier, I thought of her bruises. Every time I stood tall before my unit, I thought of her shrinking posture. It drove me harder, sharper, but it also haunted me. "You're going to burn yourself out," Sarah warned one evening as we sat on guard duty. "You cannot save the whole world." I looked at the horizon and whispered, "I just need to save her." Sarah did not argue. She understood. She had her own family scars. Instead, she handed me a piece of chocolate she had been saving, and we sat in silence, 2 women bound by survival. When our deployment ended and we returned stateside, I carried commendations, savings in the bank, and scars on my soul. I was stronger, sharper, harder. Yet the first thing I did was check messages. Letters from Mom had stopped months before. Her social media had gone dark. I reached out through Mrs. Peterson and received only silence. The absence screamed louder than any explosion I had faced overseas. The war in Afghanistan had tested my body. The silence from Springfield tested my heart. I knew Frank had tightened his hold. I knew Rick had burrowed deeper into the house. And I knew I could not ignore it forever. My vow burned hotter. One day I would return not as a frightened girl, but as a soldier forged by fire. And when I did, I would not leave empty-handed. I would bring my mother out of the darkness, no matter what it cost me. The news came on a gray morning when rain hammered the windows of the barracks at Fort Campbell. I had just returned from a run with Sarah, my lungs still burning sweat dripping down my temples, when a message reached me through the secure inbox. It was from Mrs. Peterson, the one person from Springfield I still trusted. The subject line was short. "Your mother is in the hospital. It is time to come home." My stomach clenched so violently I doubled over. For months I had lived with silence from my mother. Letters returned unopened. Social media gone dark. No calls except the ones Frank monitored and cut short. The absence had screamed at me louder than gunfire in Afghanistan. Now I had confirmation of what I had feared. He had pushed her too far. I went to my commanding officer and requested emergency leave. I said little, only that my mother was hospitalized. He studied my face and must have seen something in the tightness of my jaw, the exhaustion in my eyes. He approved it without hesitation. Within hours, I was behind the wheel of a rental car, pushing it hard down the interstate, every mile a drumbeat of dread. The 6-hour drive from Kentucky to Springfield blurred. Rain streaked across the windshield in silver sheets, headlights cutting through darkness as I pressed harder on the gas. My fingers clenched the wheel until they ached. I whispered to myself over and over, "Hold on, Mom. Hold on." Mrs. Peterson met me at a small diner 2 blocks from the hospital. She looked older lines etched deeper into her face, worry pulling at her mouth. She slid a manila folder across the booth before I could even sit. Inside were copies of my mother's medical records. My hands trembled as I flipped through them. Fractured ribs consistent with falling downstairs. Bruised trachea described as accidental injury. Malnutrition noted despite living in a middle-class home. The photographs stapled to the reports hollowed me out. My mother was a ghost of the woman she had once been. Her frame reduced to 90 pounds, her eyes vacant, makeup poorly covering bruises along her cheek. I covered my mouth to keep from crying out. Mrs. Peterson reached across the table and squeezed my hand. The neighbors called 911. After hearing screams, she said quietly. By the time police arrived, Frank had coached her on what to say. She insisted it was an accident. The hospital admitted her, but he signed her out against medical advice within 24 hours. My throat burned with bile. "And Rick?" I asked. Mrs. Peterson's expression tightened. "He moved in permanently 6 months ago. The neighbors say he watches her constantly when Frank is at work. She cannot even get mail without him hovering." Rage boiled in me hotter than desert sun. I left the diner and drove past the old house that had once been my childhood home. From 3 blocks away, I parked and approached on foot, heart thudding in my chest. The yard was overgrown weeds choking the flower beds my father had once tended. The paint peeled on the siding. Security cameras covered every angle, blinking red. Rick's van sat in the driveway like a guard dog. Through the kitchen window I saw her. My mother moved slowly, mechanically stirring something on the stove, while Rick sat at the table watching her. Her back was bent, her movements stiff like a marionette pulled by strings. When she turned, I bit down on my knuckle to keep from crying out. One side of her face was swollen purple and green. I lifted my phone and zoomed in, capturing photos of everything: the locks, the cameras, the bruises. Evidence for the war I was about to wage. That night, I spread the photographs across the motel bed, my stomach twisting. I called Thomas Morrison, an attorney recommended by a JAG officer I trusted. His office overlooked the courthouse downtown. When I met him the next morning, he scanned through the documents and photos with a frown. "Without your mother's cooperation, options are limited," he said carefully. "But this pattern of escalation, the medical records, the surveillance, we might get an emergency protective order. If we can catch him violating it, that changes everything." "Might I?" asked, my voice sharp. He folded his hands. "Frank is smart. Nothing definitive. No direct witnesses to an assault. Rick provides alibis. Your mother refuses to testify. The system is flawed, Sergeant, but it is what we have." His words should have crushed me, but instead they hardened my resolve. I had fought enemies in Afghanistan who had numbers, weapons, and territory. I had survived them. I would survive this. That week, I operated like planning a mission. I gathered financial records showing Frank draining my mother's inheritance from my father. I spoke to former neighbors who confirmed the isolation tactics. I cataloged every photograph of cameras, locks, and bruises. I built a dossier thick enough to rival any field report, but Frank was not blind. On the 5th day, I stopped at a gas station for coffee and found Rick leaning against my rental car, his arms crossed, cigarette dangling from his lips. His smile was all false warmth. "Heard you were in town," he said casually. My body tensed into defensive stance. "Get away from my car." He stepped closer, blowing smoke. "Just being friendly. Family should talk." My hand hovered near my phone. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Your mom worries about you. All this military stuff. The violence you've seen. She thinks you might be unstable." I clenched my teeth. That is Frank talking. Not her. Rick's smile widened. "Same thing, really. You should leave town. Nothing for you here. Your mother has made her choice." Heat surged through me, but I forced myself calm. Has she? Or has she been beaten into submission? Rick's eyes narrowed, mask slipping. "Careful, soldier girl. You are not in Afghanistan anymore. Different rules here. Accidents happen. Your mom is already so fragile." The threat hung heavy in the air. I stepped closer, close enough to smell his cologne mixed with smoke. My voice was steady. "You just threatened her in front of a security camera," I said, nodding toward the gas station lens above us. I lifted my phone video already recording. "And I am recording this too." "Different rules, you are right, but I know how to play by them." For a moment, anger flared in his eyes, then he forced a grin and backed away. "Won't matter," he muttered. "She will never leave him. And we know where you live now. Fort Campbell Building 2847, Apartment 3C. Amazing what public records show." My stomach lurched, but I kept my expression neutral. I got into the car and drove away, every nerve in my body electric. They had researched me. They had found my base housing. The predators were expanding their territory. That night in the motel, I spread evidence across the bed again and planned my next move. Mrs. Peterson called with worse news. Mom had been back to the hospital but left before treatment. The pattern was escalating. The system might not save her. I realized I would have to draw Frank out, force him into a mistake, bring him into a battlefield where his power meant nothing. Predators waited patiently until threatened. Then they slipped. My plan formed sharp and clear. I would not just defend. I would lure him into a place where the law was stronger than his fists. If the courts needed a violation to act, then I would give them one. This was no longer only survival. This was war. When I looked in the mirror that night in the motel, I barely recognized the reflection staring back. My hair was pulled back tight, my eyes sharp and unyielding. I was no longer the frightened teenager cowering in a locked house. I was a soldier calculating her next mission. The difference was that this enemy did not wear a uniform or carry a rifle. He wore the face of a stepfather who smiled in public and terrorized in private. He had to be drawn into a place where his cruelty was undeniable, a place where the law would not bend to his manipulation. The only way to break men like Frank and Rick was to make them expose themselves. Thomas Morrison, the attorney, laid out the strategy in his office overlooking the courthouse. His walls were lined with degrees and framed photos of past victories. He tapped his pen on the protective order documents. "We can file this, but understand it is only as strong as the enforcement. If Frank violates it, we have grounds to act. The key is catching him in the violation." His words echoed in my head like marching orders. Catch him, document him, force the system to see what we already knew. I left his office with the papers in hand and a grim smile on my face. This would not be a quiet confrontation in Springfield. This would be federal, military territory, a battlefield where Frank's influence meant nothing. He thrived on secrecy and silence. I would strip those away. Sarah Reeves called that evening. She had heard the edge in my voice during previous conversations and demanded the truth. I told her everything. The bruises, the surveillance, the threats. Silence stretched on the line before she finally spoke. "Then we make him slip," she said flatly. Her confidence steadied me. I was not alone. The plan crystallized. We would file the protective order and spread the word through Frank's network, poking at his pride, letting him know he had lost control of the narrative. Predators reacted badly when cornered. They lunged. I needed him to lunge where I was strongest. I remembered every mission briefing in Afghanistan, the way we laid out contingencies, prepared for diversions, and always set a trap. This would be no different. I spent days gathering intelligence like any operation. I tracked Frank's business associates, finding where he cut corners, where he laundered money. I spoke with neighbors who had moved away from Maple Street, collecting their testimony about his intimidation. Every detail went into my growing dossier. At night in the motel, I rehearsed scenarios, visualizing his moves, my responses. I checked the hidden emergency beacon Sarah had given me years earlier, still disguised as a jewelry box. It had saved me once. It would, again. Filing the protective order was the first volley. Standing in front of the judge, my heart hammered, but my voice remained steady. I outlined the threats, the medical records, the evidence. Thomas stood beside me, his tone calm but firm. The order was granted. It was a fragile shield, but a shield nonetheless. As we left the courthouse, I saw Rick leaning against the far wall, arms crossed, a smirk curving his mouth. He did not speak, but the message was clear. They knew. They were watching. Good, I thought. Let them watch. That evening, I called several of Frank's associates, introducing myself as Sergeant Naomi Carter. I asked pointed questions about his behavior, his treatment of my mother, his business practices. I knew word would travel back to him. I wanted it to. Predators hated exposure more than anything. That night, my phone lit up with messages from blocked numbers. Threats. Photographs of my military housing. Blurry images of Sarah walking near base. Frank was flexing, showing reach. I brought the messages to base security. They took it seriously, assigning extra patrols near my building. Sarah moved in temporarily, forming our own two-person fire team. Mom slept on the couch when she managed to stay with us, jumping at every sound. For 3 days, we lived in tense quiet, knowing the storm was building. My mother ate more regularly, color slowly returning to her face. Sarah taught her basic self-defense, small steps toward reclaiming strength. I documented everything. If Frank thought intimidation would drive me away, he miscalculated. He was stepping onto a battlefield he did not understand. On the 4th day, I visited the motor pool on base. Mechanics worked on vehicles, the smell of oil and diesel thick in the air. I studied the layout, the patrol schedules, the blind spots. If Frank was reckless enough to try breaching military grounds, he would need a diversion. That realization chilled me. He was dangerous enough to attempt it. My instincts told me he was planning something big. That evening, Mrs. Peterson called again. "He is restless," she whispered. "Frank is raging about you to anyone who will listen. He says you have poisoned your mother, that you are trying to ruin him. He is drinking more. Rick is driving him everywhere." Her words were confirmation. Pressure was working. He was unraveling. I hung up and stared at the ceiling of my apartment, the walls humming with tension. Sarah leaned against the doorframe. "He is going to make his move soon." I nodded, "And when he does, we will be ready." The waiting was the hardest part. In Afghanistan, we expected attacks, but never knew when they would come. This was the same. Every creak in the hallway, every knock at the door, every barking dog set my nerves on edge. But fear was not weakness. Fear was preparation. I used it to sharpen my senses, to ready my body for the inevitable. My mother whispered late at night that Frank would come, that he always found her. I sat beside her and took her trembling hand. "Not this time," I said. "This time he walks into our world. And in our world, there are rules and consequences he cannot escape." I watched her eyes, saw doubt flicker, then a tiny spark of belief. It was enough. The night before the storm, I checked my emergency beacon 3 times, rehearsed the sequence in my head. Sarah placed her baseball bat by the couch. We were soldiers preparing a defensive perimeter, our small apartment transformed into a stronghold. Outside base security patrolled, but I knew Frank would try to outmaneuver them. He always believed he was smarter, always believed he was untouchable. That arrogance would be his undoing. When I finally lay down that night, I felt the weight of years pressing on my chest. Childhood nights of whispered apologies. Teenage years of stolen dreams. Deployment nights under desert stars. All of it converged here. Tomorrow or the next day, Frank would make his move. And when he did, the game would change forever. The predator was coming into my territory, and predators who walked into traps never walked out the same. It happened on a Thursday. February 18th, the hour was 2:30 a.m. The same cursed time when my nightmares always woke me the same time. Frank had chosen years ago to break through doors. I woke instantly, every nerve firing. The silence was wrong. The base was never silent. Dogs barked at everything. Tonight, the military police dog in the next building was quiet. Too quiet. I pushed off the blanket and whispered Sarah. She was already awake, eyes wide, sitting up from the couch where she had been keeping watch beside my mother. We both heard it then, footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate moving toward us. Not the relaxed step of a soldier coming back late from duty. Not the shuffle of a neighbor. This was intent. This was a predator announcing himself. My stomach clenched. I mouthed the word, "ready." Sarah reached for the baseball bat leaning against the couch. My mother clutched the blanket tighter around her shoulders, trembling, whispering prayers under her breath. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A heartbeat of silence, then the world exploded. The door slammed inward with a deafening crack, the wood splintering. Frank filled the doorway like a nightmare made, flesh shoulders hunched, face twisted in fury. Behind him was Rick, pushing the door shut. I heard the metallic snap of a lock jamming from the outside. They had brought something to wedge it. We were trapped. Frank stepped into the apartment with a mocking smile. "Evening, Sergeant," he said, his voice dripping venom. "Nice place." Tax dollars at work. My body locked into combat mode. My mind ticked through options. The beacon on the nightstand was 8 feet away. My service weapon was locked in the safe per regulations. Too far. Too late. Sarah stood tall with her bat, her jaw set. I planted my feet, shoulders squared, placing myself between Frank and my mother. "You are violating a protective order," I said, clearly, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. "You are trespassing on federal property. The MPs will be here any second." Rick chuckled from outside the door. "The MPs are dealing with a fire in the motor pool. Anonymous tip about suspicious activity. They will be busy for at least 20 minutes. My blood ran cold. A diversion. They had planned this with precision, the same way I had once planned patrols in Afghanistan. Frank's eyes locked on my mother. He ignored me entirely. "Everything in that house was mine," he growled. "You forgot that, Linda. You forgot who owns you." My mother whimpered, shrinking back, but I stepped forward. "She is not your property. Not anymore. Not ever again." His face contorted in rage. He lunged faster than I expected, grabbing the chair by the desk and swinging it. I ducked, but it clipped my shoulder, sending me spinning against the wall. Pain shot through me, hot and sharp, but pain meant I was alive. Sarah raised her bat and swung hard. It cracked against Frank's arm, forcing him back a step. He roared and threw the chair aside. The apartment was too small, too cramped. No room for wide movements, only close quarters. He grabbed for me again, and this time I let him. I let him get close enough. My knee shot up, slamming into his thigh, then my fingers jabbed at his eyes in a move Sarah had taught me from the streets. He roared, stumbling, but his grip on my arm tightened. My vision blurred from the force. I twisted, throwing myself toward the nightstand. My fingers scraped the surface, searching desperately. The jewelry box. My salvation. Frank yanked me back, but I slammed my palm down 3 times. The beacon activated, silent but screaming across the base. Sirens would already be wailing. Help was coming. Frank did not know. He thought he was still in control. His fist connected with my jaw, and stars burst in my vision. I tasted blood, but forced myself not to fall. Sarah swung again, connecting with his ribs. He bellowed and shoved her aside. My mother cried out, "Stop! Please stop!" But this was beyond stopping. This was the storm breaking loose after years of suffocating silence. Rick pounded on the door from outside. "Hurry up, Frank! Someone is coming." But Frank was beyond reason. He lunged again, pinning me against the wall. His face was inches from mine, spit flying as he shouted, "You think you beat me? You think leaving made you strong? You are still nothing." My head spun. My shoulder throbbed, but rage steadied me. "No," I spat back, blood on my lips. "I am stronger than you ever were, and tonight proves it." His eyes widened in surprise at my defiance, just for a moment, but it was enough. I twisted, drove my elbow into his ribs, slammed my forehead against his nose. Pain flared through my skull, but he reeled back with a howl. Sarah was on him instantly, swinging with every ounce of strength. The bat cracked against his shoulder, then his leg. He staggered, but still stood. He raised a fist to strike her. My mother screamed, "No!" Something broke in her voice. For the first time in years, she did not whisper. She shouted. That sound cut through everything. It gave me the surge I needed. I threw myself at him, tackling his midsection. We crashed into the desk papers, scattering, lamp shattering. My shoulder screamed, but I did not let go. Outside the door, Rick cursed. I heard the scrape of metal. He was trying to unjam the lock. Then the sound that split the air sirens. Loud, overlapping, filling the building. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows. Frank froze, disbelief on his face. "Rick!" he shouted, but Rick's footsteps were already retreating down the hall. He was abandoning him, saving himself. No honor among predators. Frank looked around wildly, realization dawning. He had walked into a trap. My trap. The door burst open, not forced, but unlocked from the outside. Military police flooded in weapons drawn. They saw my bruised face, my bleeding lip, my torn shoulder. They saw Frank's wild eyes and bloodied knuckles. They saw my mother clutching her bruised arms, tears streaking her face. "Hands behind your head," one shouted. Frank hesitated, his chest heaving. For a second, I thought he might try to fight, but then he saw the rifles aimed at the authority he could not twist. Slowly, with fury in his eyes, he raised his hands. They cuffed him, pressed him to his knees. He glared at me with the hatred of a predator denied its prey. "This is not over," he spat. My voice was steady, my body shaking, but my words steel. "Yes, Frank, it is." The room spun as adrenaline drained, but I stood tall. Sarah's arm went around my shoulders. My mother sobbed her knees giving out, but I caught her holding her tight. The hallway outside thundered with boots as more MPs secured the area. Radios crackled. Orders flew. The base had erupted in response to my beacon. Helicopters roared overhead, searchlights sweeping the grounds. Frank had triggered not just my anger, but the full might of military security. He thought he could invade my sanctuary. Instead, he had walked into a cage. I watched them drag him out, his curses fading down the hallway. The fear that had chained me for years cracked and crumbled. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Fear. The sirens outside still echoed in my ears long after Frank was hauled out in cuffs. My apartment looked like a battlefield. The front door splintered furniture overturned shards of glass glittering on the floor. Blood droplets stained the tiles. Not mine. His. I stood in the wreckage chest, heaving, shoulder screaming with pain, but I refused to sit down. I would not give him that image of me broken. My mother clung to me, whispering, "Is it over? Is it really over?" I could not answer yet. Sarah squeezed my good shoulder and whispered, "It is ending. That is what matters." Outside in the hallway, the sound of boots and radios was constant. Military police locked down the building. K-9 units swept the grounds. Helicopters circled above with spotlights cutting through the night. Frank had not just attacked me. He had violated federal law by breaking into military housing, by attacking a service member, by orchestrating a diversion at the motor pool. This was no longer just domestic violence. This was federal crime, and that changed everything. Staff Sergeant Thompson approached, weapon still in hand, his expression grim but steady. "Sergeant Carter, are you injured?" I swallowed hard. "Shoulder dislocated, maybe?" "Nothing life-threatening." He nodded, signaling for medics. Then his radio crackled. "We have the brother, brown van Tennessee plates, caught at checkpoint trying to ram through. He is in custody." Relief surged through me, so strong my knees almost buckled. Rick, the shadow who had haunted hallways and locked doors, was finally caught. Thompson turned back to me. "Both suspects are secured. They will be transferred to federal holding." Frank's curses echoed faintly as they dragged him toward the transport van. "You think you won?" "She will come back. She always comes back." His voice cracked with desperation. For the first time in my life, I saw him stripped of power. My mother straightened her voice, trembling but clear. "No, Frank, you do not own me anymore." The words sliced the air sharper than any blade. The MPs paused, startled by the sudden defiance. Frank jerked against his restraints, trying to silence her, but it was too late. She had spoken. The spell was broken. My chest swelled with pride. She was finding her voice again. Medics examined my shoulder, wrapping it tight, documenting every bruise and cut. They photographed my injuries, my torn clothes, the shattered door frame. Evidence. Proof. No more whispers in the dark. Everything was out in the open now. Captain Rodriguez from JAG arrived, a thick folder in his hand. His eyes swept the room, landing on me. "Sergeant Carter, you did well. This is now a federal case. Breaking into military housing, assaulting personnel, violating protective orders, creating diversions on federal property. These are not small charges. We are talking decades behind bars." Frank's face drained of color when he heard. He had expected local police, maybe a slap on the wrist. He had not anticipated federal jurisdiction military prosecutors and charges of arson and conspiracy. Rick cracked first. Even before they loaded him into the van, word came through that he was already talking, already shifting blame. No loyalty among predators. Rodriguez smirked. "Your uncle is cooperating. He has confessed to everything, even crimes we had not uncovered yet. He claims it was all Frank's idea. That betrayal will bury them both." For a moment, I almost laughed. The brotherhood they had built on fear collapsed at the first sign of real consequence. My mother stepped forward, surprising everyone. Her voice, once so small, carried steady. "I want to testify. All of it. The years of abuse, the isolation, the threats." "I want it on record," Frank snapped. "Shut your mouth, Linda." But she lifted her chin. "No, you shut yours. For once in your miserable life, you will listen. You took everything from me, my freedom, my dignity, my family. But you did not break me. You bent me, you hurt me, you almost killed me, but I am still here, and I am not afraid anymore." The MPs pulled him back as he lunged, but his rage only underscored her truth. For the first time in years, I felt the crushing weight of silence lift. My mother had chosen light over darkness. The hours after blurred in a storm of statements, evidence collection, and medical care. I gave testimony to investigators recounting every detail of the night from the moment footsteps approached to the beacon activation. Sarah gave hers too, describing how she swung the bat with all her strength. My mother's statement was the hardest to watch. She trembled as she relived years of fear, but she forced the words out, reclaiming each piece of her stolen voice. Victim advocates surrounded her, offering support, promising protection, relocation therapy. For once, she was not alone. Dawn broke over the base golden light streaming through shattered wood and broken glass. I stood on the steps outside the apartment, my arm in a sling, watching as Frank and Rick were loaded into separate vans. Frank glared at me through the window eyes full of venom, but beneath it I saw something else. Fear. Real fear. He was entering a world of rules he could not twist, consequences he could not escape. I spoke loud enough for him to hear. "Control built on fear always crumbles, Frank. Real strength comes from surviving men like you and choosing never to become you." He turned away, but I knew my words had struck. The vans rolled out, engines growling, carrying them to a future behind bars. As they disappeared, my mother slipped her hand into mine. For years, she had recoiled from touch, too afraid, too broken. Now she reached for me on her own. "Is it really over?" she whispered. I looked at her, the morning sun painting her face in gold. "It is the beginning," I said. "The beginning of your real life." Later that morning, the base commander visited personally, apologizing for the security breach that had allowed Frank and Rick inside. He promised a full investigation, strengthened protocols, better protection for families. He thanked me for activating the beacon, for holding out long enough for help to arrive. I nodded, but inside I knew the truth. This victory was not just about me. It was about my mother finally standing, about Sarah refusing to let me fight alone, about the military family that had answered the call. We had not just survived, we had won. The news spread quickly across the base. People I barely knew offered help, food, and protection. Sarah moved with ease among them, already planning to start a self-defense class for military spouses. My mother sat with victim advocates, her back straight, her voice firmer with each word. Federal prosecutors prepared charges that would put Frank away for at least 25 years and Rick for 15. The weight of justice pressed heavy, but it was justice nonetheless. That night, when the apartment had been repaired enough for me to return, I stood in the doorway and let the silence wash over me. Not the suffocating silence of fear, but the peaceful silence of safety. I thought of the girl who had once cried into her pillow, convinced there was no way out. I thought of the soldier who had stared into desert skies, wondering if freedom was real. And I thought of the woman standing now, bruised but unbroken, finally free. The predator had been caged. The cycle had been shattered. Justice had arrived. The days that followed felt like breathing after years underwater. My body was bruised, my shoulder bound tight, my lips still swollen, yet the air filled my lungs differently. It no longer carried the taste of fear. For the first time since I was a girl, the walls around me did not echo with Frank's voice or Rick's footsteps. They were both in federal custody, locked behind bars where their fists and threats meant nothing. The prosecutors moved quickly. Captain Rodriguez explained that the evidence was overwhelming: the protective order violation, the assault on federal property, the arson diversion at the motor pool. Rick had confessed in detail, hoping to save himself, but in doing so, he destroyed Frank. The charges guaranteed decades of prison time, 25 years minimum, possibly more. For Rick, 15. When I heard the numbers, I felt a strange mix of triumph and sorrow. Triumph because justice had finally landed. Sorrow because no sentence could restore the years lost, the innocence stolen. My mother met with victim advocates daily. They arranged transitional housing on base, therapy sessions, medical care. I watched her slowly reclaim pieces of herself I thought were gone forever. She stood straighter, spoke louder, laughed softly at things Sarah said. The bruises faded, but the scars would take longer. One morning I found her sitting by the window, sunlight warming her face. She turned to me and whispered, "I do not know how to start over." I knelt beside her and took her hand. "You start by living, by choosing freedom every day, by remembering that you deserve to breathe without asking permission." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of release, not despair. The trial came months later. Federal court was stark, the seal of the United States hanging heavy above the judge. I sat in uniform beside Sarah, my arm still marked by faint scars, while my mother testified. Her voice trembled at first, but as she described years of isolation and violence, she grew stronger. The courtroom leaned forward silent. Frank sat in shackles, his eyes burning but powerless. Rick slouched beside him, avoiding everyone's gaze. When my mother declared, "He does not own me anymore," the silence broke into murmurs. The judge's gavel slammed, but the message had already landed. For once, the truth was louder than Frank. When the sentences were read, my mother wept openly. 25 years for Frank, 15 for Rick. I placed my hand on her back, steadying her. Justice did not erase the past, but it carved a future where fear no longer dictated our lives. After the trial, life did not magically become perfect. Healing is not a straight line. My mother woke at night from nightmares, reaching for light switches, whispering apologies into the dark. I held her hand until her breathing slowed. Sometimes I woke, gasping myself dreams of Frank's fist inches from my face. But we faced it together. Therapy became our battlefield now, each session another mission, each confession another victory. Sarah remained by my side, more sister than friend. Together, we began teaching self-defense classes for military spouses and daughters. We turned pain into purpose, showing others how to fight back, how to protect themselves, how to believe in their own strength. Watching women and girls discover power in their own bodies felt like redemption. My mother even attended one class learning simple moves. She laughed nervously, but when she managed to break free from Sarah's hold during a drill, her smile lit the room. It was the first genuine smile I had seen in years. That image stayed with me. One evening we sat together on the porch of her transitional housing, sipping coffee as the sun dipped low. She looked at me and said softly, "I thought I had failed you. I let him hurt us. I let him cage us." I shook my head firmly. "You survived. That takes more strength than anyone will ever know. And when the moment came, you stood up. You spoke. That is what saved us." She leaned against me, and for once the silence between us felt whole, not broken. My career in the Army continued, but my mission expanded. I used my voice to advocate for survivors of domestic violence, speaking at bases, sharing my story, reminding others that the enemy is not always across oceans. Sometimes it is in the very place we are supposed to feel safe. Each time I spoke, I watched faces in the crowd soften, eyes widen, hands tighten. I knew the message was reaching those who needed it. Healing was slow, but it was real. The apartment was repaired, the door replaced with steel reinforcement. Yet I kept the old broken frame stored away as a reminder of the night everything changed. A reminder that fear can be broken, that predators can fall. The military family rallied around us. Meals delivered offers of housing support at every step. We were not alone anymore. Frank had tried to isolate us to convince us no one would help, but he was wrong. The community proved it. As months passed, I noticed small but powerful changes in my mother. She no longer flinched when a door slammed. She spoke freely on the phone with her sister again. She began teaching part-time at a community center, reading stories to children, her voice warm and steady. Watching her rediscover purpose was like watching someone learn to breathe after drowning. One morning, I found her writing in a journal. She looked up and smiled shyly. "Just trying to put things on paper," she explained. I hugged her. That is how healing begins. The final chapter of Frank and Rick's hold on us ended quietly. News arrived that both had been transferred to federal facilities far from Ohio, surrounded by walls higher than any they had built around us. My mother exhaled deeply as if shedding a final weight. "They cannot touch us anymore," she said. And she was right. They would spend their best years staring at bars while we built new lives. The past would always exist, but it no longer owned us. On the anniversary of the night they broke in, I stood with Sarah and my mother watching the sunrise. The sky burned orange and gold, a symbol of survival. My mother slipped her hand into mine and whispered, "Your life begins now." "And so does mine." I smiled through tears, squeezing her hand. "Yes, Mom. Now we live." The war was over, but the lessons remained. Freedom is not given. It is fought for. And when fear finally shatters, what rises in its place is stronger than anything that tried to destroy it. If you have listened this far, I want to take a moment to speak directly to you. This story was not just about broken doors, shattered nights, and the fear that crept through hallways at 2 a.m. It was about survival. It was about the courage to stand up against those who believe control and intimidation can silence us forever. It was about reclaiming dignity when someone tries to strip it away. And most importantly, it was about justice finding its way into the darkest places. For many of you, watching pieces of this story may have echoed in your own life. Maybe you have seen the face of control behind closed doors. Maybe you have watched a loved one shrink under the weight of someone else's anger. Or maybe you have carried your own vow, the promise that one day you would no longer live in silence. If that is you, I want you to know you are not alone. You never were. Stories like Naomi's remind us that fear can be powerful, but it is never permanent. Strength does not always roar. Sometimes it is found in whispered promises at midnight, in the decision to gather evidence, in the courage to press a beacon, even when the odds feel impossible. Strength is the mother who finally raises her voice after years of silence. Strength is the survivor who turns pain into purpose. Strength is you watching right now, remembering that freedom is not a gift someone else can hand you, it is something you claim. Now I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. Tell me your city, your state, or simply say, "I'm here." These stories connect us across miles, across generations. When you share where you are from, you remind others that this community is wide and strong, that no one is facing darkness alone. And if parts of this story resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Share your reflections in the comments. Have you ever witnessed a moment when silence was finally broken? Do you know someone who found courage when it mattered most? Your voice matters. Your stories matter. By speaking them out, you shine a light for others who might still be in shadow. If you found meaning in this story, I ask you to subscribe to this channel. When you subscribe, you are not just following along, you are standing with a community that believes in truth, justice, and healing. Click the notification bell so you will not miss the next story, because each one carries the same heartbeat, survival, courage, and consequences for those who harm. And finally, if this story touched you, share it. Share it with a friend who needs to know they are not alone. Share it with a family member who might not understand the hidden battles others are fighting. Share it because truth once spoken spreads further than silence ever could. Together, we are stronger than any darkness. Together, we choose freedom over fear.